Next question today. David, if Trump does delay the election, can you tell me definitively who becomes president? I've heard Nancy Pelosi. I've heard Chuck Grassley. I don't really understand. Okay, so this came up briefly in a voicemail earlier this week, but let's go through it again. If Donald Trump delays the election enough, and again, I'm not debating here whether he can do it, how it could be done, how much he would do. I don't want to do that stuff because there's all sorts, the electors have to vote. I believe it's in the first half of December, and there's other dates, and elections are run by the states. These are 50 state decisions, more than they are anything that Donald Trump would do. So let's skip that piece for now. But let's imagine we get to January 20th and there has not been an election. Trump doesn't stay in power. Trump stops being the president. Now, when you look at the line of succession, okay, it would go from president to vice president, but Mike Pence also would no longer be vice president. Well, then it would go to the Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi. Well, if the election in California doesn't happen, she is no longer elected. So she's no longer Speaker of the House. So it would skip her. So eventually it would go to the Senate pro tem. Now, currently, the Senate pro tem is Chuck Grassley, a Republican, because Republicans have the majority in the Senate. But the problem is that 35 Senate seats are up for election in November. Of the 100 Senate seats, if those 35 elections don't happen, again, we're assuming none of the elections happen. You might have some states do the election, but not enough to select a president. But let's skip that for now. If those 35 Senate seats end up being open, you now only have 65 senators. And that means that the Democrats would have a majority because Republicans have far more seats to defend in November than do Democrats. So if none of these 35 elections happen, Republicans lose more seats than Democrats. You then have no president, no vice president, no House, but you have a Senate made up of the 65 remaining senators who are more than 50% Democrats, meaning Democrats get to select a Senate pro tem who becomes the president until this is resolved. Now, historically, again, this is our best understanding. Producer Pat and I have been researching this. This is our best understanding. Historically, Senate pro tem tends to go to the most senior senator from the party. Right now, that's Vermont's Patrick Leahy. However, it's conceivable that if the 65 remaining senators knew that by electing a Senate pro tem, they were essentially selecting the next president, it's conceivable they would pick someone other than Patrick Leahy. But that's the scenario, as I best understand it today, that would determine who is president if we don't have a presidential election in November. Now, let me go back to what I said when I commented on James Clyburn earlier this week, saying I think Trump is going to, after he loses, use some kind of emergency to stay in power. I believe that our coverage of that possibility needs to focus around the idea that the mere suggestion of delaying a federal election, which has never happened, is a despotic, authoritarian, dystopian nightmare. Now that I was asked the question, what exactly would happen? I've answered it to the best of my ability. I don't think that's where the focus should be. The focus should be that Trump even floating this idea is completely outrageous. We vote in this country. We figure out how to do it. States are expanding absentee ballot access, universal absentee voting, as I'm calling it. And we're going to have an election. And Donald Trump is going to either win or not win, and things are going to happen on the schedule they're supposed to. That has to be the default conversation. Once you start engaging in what would justify delaying it or what would be the mechanism for delaying it, academically, it's interesting, but it's problematic when it becomes a corporate media dialogue, which only legitimizes the idea at its core. So that's my take on that.